allow me to introduce our main speaker and moderator, Linda Carter.
Thanks so much, Juliet. I'm really honored to be here and very much appreciate your inviting me to do this. I'm also delighted to be collaborating with the other women. I just wish that we'd had more time maybe to get to know each other and talk a little bit, but we put this together quickly because we were really concerned about what's been happening in the world in general, and for nurses and anyone in the helping professions or first responders. So Juliet and I have worked really hard and as quickly as we could to get this put together. So anyway, we've done our best, and we hope that this in some ways could be a moment of containment and sharing. And there's something very important about stories, storytelling, myth, ritual, and being in relationship with others during times of great stress and world upheaval. So we thought it would be a good idea to start with a very beautiful piece by an artist from Austria. Her name is Pia Imbar. She made a beautiful image of a globe. And her friend, Catherine Schneider, produced a piano piece to go with it. This was one of our submissions made by Ernst Faltsater. Ernst is a psychoanalytic historian. He did a lot of work on Ferenczi, but also on Jung and the Red Book. He's very well known, very lovely guy, jazz pianist, multi-talented. And so when I got his submission, we invited a number of people to submit pieces for this project. When he submitted it, I loved it immediately, but I was concerned because I know a good bit from publishing about permissions and so forth. So I had an intuition that maybe he knew her. Well, not only did he know Pia, she lives in the same apartment building, and she was more than happy to give permission for us to publish it. Not only that, she and Catherine have produced this little film clip, and Juliet and I felt like it would be a really good idea to show it today to start. And if we have time, we could show it again at the end. It might be a nice way to close things as a kind of artistic bookend, as a way to hold us. And here we are in Zoom land, and I am about to go crazy with all the technology stuff that works or doesn't work. But on the other hand, if we didn't have the technology and Zoom and the things that we have, we wouldn't be connecting as we are today. So it's a blessing and a curse. It's a complicated thing. So let's, Gavin, let's proceed, and we'll show the film clip. It's just 2 minutes, and then we'll show it again, I think, at the end. see this clip. And I think what's so important about it is it shows the process of the creation, but it also shows collaboration between Pia and Catherine, but also with Ernst, who offered the following commentary that I find very moving. And as an editor, what's happened with this project and with a number of others, very often I'll ask an editorial question or offer a query, and things will surprisingly unfold. And through this daily image project, we just hit number 40. I've edited 40 of these, 40 days worth since the beginning of April. It actually makes me a little teary. 40. So as part of the editing process, you begin to get to know people and you learn what's happening, and it's a whole process in and of itself. And so as part of that, I began to see the process of these two artists with Ernst, and he offered a lovely way of thinking about Pia's process. This is what Ernst says. In these times when anxiety, uncertainty, and insecurity are interspersed with hope and a profound questioning of our society's values and ethics, I propose this painting by Pia Imbar, which represents our pregnant Earth. To me, it is a powerful reminder of how important it is to take care of the world that we will eventually leave to our children. And it is my hope that the present crisis may also be pregnant with insights that may lead to solutions and decisions that are more respectful of life on this planet in all of its forms. So on here is the YouTube, how to connect to it if you would like to see it again. And if you'd like to connect with the Daily Image Project, just go to aras, aras.org, aras.org, and you can sign on to receive the daily image every day in your inbox. So let's see. So much has changed since we started this project in February. And with the recent upheaval, just in even the last couple days, what I thought of saying originally when Juliet and I talked, things had happened so quickly and changed so much that I really shifted how I've been thinking about this presentation today. One of the things that Jung did particularly well was something that he called amplification. It was a method of analogy. And he was really very artful at matching myths, stories, fairy tales, and legends to deeper levels of patterns that he would sense in the unconscious of the patient. And it's really not so magical, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. But when I was thinking about this presentation, what came to me today, this is a kind of amplification. It's a method of analogy. So one thing, we just saw the globe and the baby, and it's very hopeful and so forth. And yet, since we started working on this, Juliet and I, just over the last couple of weeks, it just feels like the whole world has come apart. And I think it needs to in some ways. Sometimes things need to fall apart so that they can come back together again. And yet, I don't know. I mean, a global pandemic with this kind of loss of life and the painful experiences socioculturally with racial that have been bubbling around for a long time that need to be addressed. They needed to come forward. And yet, how do we help ourselves offer containment as individuals to ourselves, to our families, to our patients, and still move forward with hope? And that's a very complicated question. So I've been highly influenced by working with the Chinese, oh my God, I've been talking a long time, by the Chinese over the last 6 years or so. And so I began to hear about the pandemic in Wuhan in February. And it was very upsetting because these young therapists were manning hotlines and trying to do depth analysis in half-hour phone calls. They didn't really understand what crisis intervention was about. It's more about containment, holding. This isn't a time for going into deep emotional states. And the feeling is that first responders, healthcare people, this is not the time to unpack deep emotion, but to figure out how to hold on to oneself. And through art, image, and symbol, we felt like that may be a way to be helpful. So when I was hearing about this, I meet once a month with a colleague who also works with the Chinese, and the level of attachment trauma that we have experienced with them is something beyond anything I've ever known. It's quite something. And so when I was talking to my friend Liza about what was happening in Wuhan, I think people say, well, you're a nurse. I mean, do you work in a hospital sometimes? You're an adult? How does that work? Well, I'm a nurse. I've always been a nurse. So analytic practice to me is the practice of nursing. And for me and my family, a deep value was service. Service. My mother was a nurse. My grandmother was a nurse. My father was a general practitioner in a small town. But it's about service. It's about helping other people. Part of doing this is also taking care of oneself. So when I returned from the Chinese, in nursing school, we learned about hospital care and so forth, but we also taught a lot about public health and healthcare systems. I come from a public health background. So my imagining was, is there a way for us to send pictures, images to the Chinese who were trapped in Wuhan in their apartments? Little did I realize this would be a global pandemic. So I began looking into how to find a platform and how we could do it. Whole complicated process. We put a team, we reassembled the Art and Psyche working group. So we developed a collaborative team, tech person, different skills and so forth. So we came up with this idea. We partnered with ARIS. They had a stable platform. And what we were really looking for at the outset was a platform accessible globally, especially in China, because a lot of things are not accessible. And ARIS is an institution, Pacifica universities are institutions, so we wanted to make sure that would work. So we've partnered with ARIS in the past. They've been generous and very kind, and that's kind of how this whole project came into being. So we've been showing an image with a 100-word commentary on a daily basis now for 40 days. And really the goal of our project is to create a network of mutual support through art during this difficult time. It's shifting now. So we have invited a number of colleagues to contribute images and commentaries that represent companionship, hope, and resilience in the face of fear and struggle. And each day, we hope that people will find daily postings and we'll form an ever-growing virtual gallery. So you can get a daily posting, but still go into the virtual gallery and see what's been there for the other 39 days. And we didn't really intend, but really what's happened is it's ended up to be a Jungian form of amplification in a certain sense. And what we've been doing is doing our best to sense, the curator and I and our group, matching what we sense is happening kind of in the zeitgeist. And it's been hit or miss. I mean, sometimes it matches, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it fits for one person, sometimes it doesn't. The hope is if today doesn't fit, you'll stick with it for tomorrow, or you'll go back to the virtual gallery and fit with something that is resonant with your own experience. And again, we're talking about multiple levels of resonance. Because when there's resonance, you're connected, you're interacting, and maybe you're not feeling so alone and so hopeless. And so when I was pitching this project to ARIS, this was the commentary that I offered. And this is an image by Tiepolo. During moments of fear and anxiety, I bring forward this image that I first saw in Venice many years ago. It helps me to remember that there are often unexpected, even surprising and miraculous helpers who come forward from the outer world and from within. Often strong aspects of myself I'd forgotten about, but who have not forgotten me, emerge at such times. Even just the memory of this painting and the day when I first encountered it eases the suffering. Now, the group from the beginning, we agreed we wouldn't be Pollyanna. We wouldn't only have mother-baby soft. We would have maybe things that would be disruptive. But we wanted to show maybe images of suffering because there's companionship in that too. If I see an image, I know that others are suffering. Don't wish that on others are suffering. I don't have to be so alone. What I would like to say here essentially is art and free play are essential for health and well-being. In a world of acceleration, I think in some ways the pause and slowing down allows for free play. Children and adults are so scheduled, there's no space for creativity, to reflect, to think, to just rest and see what emerges. So ideas just don't come. There's stories about Kekule and the benzene ring and people who get these innovations through dream, but it doesn't come out of nowhere. They've spent years developing skills. And Jung, with his matching process, with amplification, he had a fantastic traditional education in art, literature, philosophy, theology, religion, and so forth. He was a physician. He was a superb diagnostician. So there's a famous psychoanalyst named Wilfred Bion who says you should enter every hour free of memory, desire, and understanding. Well, that's true, but it's also not true. You can do that once you have a certain proficiency of skill. You can let go and see what emerges. And I think what nurses do is we have a certain skill set that we have in common from basic nursing training. Once you have that skill set, once you've practiced it 10,000 times, the rule of 10,000, that's been debunked, you have to have a sort of genetic makeup and biological capability from the outset to really become a master at something. But if you're on the track of your own talent, you practice it, you know, that falls into the implicit domain. You practice the piano, you have to think about it. It falls into the background. Then the art of the work. So first you have to develop skill and craft. Then the art can be a part of one's practice. So I think a lot of nurses have been able to do that. And what I'll say is, this is my grandmother. She got through the Spanish flu epidemic. She almost got kicked out of nursing school for sending a body to the wrong family. Wakes and funerals were held in family parlors. And so you can just imagine that when they opened the box, it wasn't Uncle Joe inside. So it was a family joke, but I didn't realize until this summer when I visited the Florence Nightingale Museum. There was a special exhibition on the Spanish flu pandemic. Little did I realize that this would be happening, not so far into the future. In any case, you can go online and you can read the things I've written about my mother, my grandmother, and my family and nursing. But I see this outreach project as a kind of public health project, an attempt to bring together image, art, neuroscience, and hopefully offer a sense of companionship and interconnection during a time of world crisis. Where the project goes from here, I think we're in the process of reevaluating. So thanks so very much. I think I've got about 100 more slides, and you never know how these things are going to go. And again, I apologize for not having a chance to be able to have it more of a back and forth with the audience. Elizabeth Ann Robinson is the author of The Soul of a Nurse. She received her bachelor's degree in nursing from Samuel Merritt University in Oakland, her master's degree in nursing from the University of California, San Francisco, and her PhD in mythological studies and depth psychology from Pacifica Graduate Institute. A fourth-generation Californian, Elizabeth has been a staff nurse in oncology and cardiology at Stanford Medical Center, administrator at Duke Heart Center, and a clinical nurse specialist in cardiology and critical care at Sequoia Hospital, Redwood City, and Sutter Medical Center, Sacramento. She lives in Santa Barbara, where her maternal grandmother grew up, works part-time as a clinical policy writer at the local hospital, and writes and speaks from the perspective of a nurse, a patient, and a mythologist. Please welcome Elizabeth Robinson. And I must say that when I moved here, her book had recently come out and it was being displayed all over Pacifica. And I was so thrilled to see that book. And I'm very grateful that Cheryl Van Scoy introduced me to Elizabeth. And I immediately bought 5 copies from my supervision group with 3 nurses and a psychiatrist I've been in for 25 years. In any case, Elizabeth, we're delighted to have you. So please welcome Elizabeth. I wish we could all applaud for you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Linda. I really appreciated you setting us up today. I have been thinking a lot about what to say, and this morning I decided to write a letter. So I'm going to read that now. Dear nurse, I've been thinking about you nonstop during the time of extreme uncertainty. I keep hearing you called hero, and it hits me wrong. I'm sure you don't feel more heroic now, trying to figure out how to care for contagious patients without guidelines and without protection, without PPE, to protect yourself and your loved ones. Nurses are not called to the profession for danger. Nursing is now dangerous. Who will enter nursing now as they watch the current nurses exhausted and dispirited, unable to safely do their job because they are not supported? Year after year, Gallup polls show the nurse is the most trusted professional in society. If that is so, where is the PPE? Why are we still struggling to find N95s? Where are the clear guidelines, the ventilators, and why are there more and more shortages of IV fluids and medications? Hospitals used to be run by nurses and physicians. Now they're profit-driven businesses, and even the charting has lost its narrative through Epic's billing-focused documentation, adding more computer time rather than patient time, as nurses are forced to clock in and out for a 30-minute lunch on Kronos, a system named for the god who ate his children. My alma mater, UCSF, sent 25 nurses and physicians to New York City to help out for a month during their surge. They all came back without the virus and healthy. So it is possible to stay safe if we have the right equipment. The Robert Wood Johnson Future of Nursing study of 2010 stated clearly that not only nurses practice to the full extent of their education and training, but should absolutely be at the table of all healthcare policy making. This has not happened. How do we make sense of this time? Without clear leadership, we are all having to figure things out on our own. I feel a revolution coming on. Things have to change for women's equality, for climate, for people of color. We need universal health care for all, and nurses need to be at the forefront of how decisions are made. We need to stop allowing hotel, airline, fighter pilot models to infiltrate healthcare systems. Nurses are way too tolerant of this new money-saving bean counting rollouts dressed up as putting the patient first, when what it really is a way to save money, make money, check regulation boxes, and prevent litigation. We keep doing things without thinking about the consequences. I have personally lived my entire adult life focused on having a job so I can have health care. I've had pre-existing conditions since I was 16 when I had Hodgkin's disease. This pandemic has removed the veil on so many things. Health insurance should not be attached to jobs. I was on the front lines of another plague in the early 1980s in nursing school. I took care of AIDS patients, so sick, so scared, before we knew what the virus was. We didn't really know how it was spread, and we didn't wear gloves, masks, or any PPE then. It was a scary, uncertain time, learning the art of nursing while feeling the confusion of a new contagion. The first case of AIDS in California was 1981. Universal precautions, which we all follow very carefully now, they were not put out by the CDC until I was a new grad at Stanford in the fall of 1987. Black and brown people contracted AIDS more than others, just like COVID-19. I can't breathe is the collective now. The knee on the neck of George Floyd, so symbolic for so many injustices, inequities, and outright cruelty. Dear nurse, can you breathe? I hold my breath as I pass another person on my daily pre-dawn walk. Breath is the connection from the inside to the outside. What is the call to action, my dear nurse friend? This is not business as usual. Disasters bring what is essential to the surface. It's a reorientation of values, of ethics, and professional identity. We must do this together because the risks are high and we cannot trust the profit-driven authorities to provide our protection and the resources that we need to take care of our patients in a safe, compassionate manner. Dear nurse, you are the most trusted professional in society. Your value is profound. Your deep understanding of humanity, suffering, of what we need as humans in healthcare is more comprehensive and practical and real than any other. The time for silence of nurses needs to end. I am worried about the post-traumatic stress that will linger after this intense time. We'll find ways to deal with it. We'll do that together, writing, sharing, speaking together. We must have each other's back. In the meantime, dear nurse, go inside, listen to what's there. Feel your fear and your anger and your grief and your anxiety, and let the tears flow, the sounds and words release from your body so you don't become hopeless. It's important also to complain with the colleagues you trust. This is a ritual of shared experience. Pay attention to your dreams and call on not only the expert modern wisdom of Johns Hopkins, but also the ancient wisdom of the classics to keep connected to our ancestors. Watch Abbey Theatre's Dear Ireland on YouTube, New York's Theater of War, both current, real, and get right to the heart. So many are speaking their truth right now. I cannot wait to hear yours. For fear and bravery meet in courage, and courage is to speak one's heart. Speak your heart, dear nurse, and we will listen. With love, in this time of COVID-19, I remain your faithful servant. Thank you.
My reaction was brava. I feel moved to tears. I feel like that should be on the front page of the New York Times tomorrow. And everyone should read what you wrote. Just beautifully done, Elizabeth. Really profoundly moving. And we could spend hours just on what you've just had to say. I can't thank you enough.
Thank you.
So my hope is that with the different stories that we tell today, we'll weave together a variety of perspectives. Jung talked about circumambulation of the dream, walking around, getting different points of view. And I think what we're trying to do here today is walking around the nurse and what the nurse archetype means in this time, in this culture, in this world. So Elizabeth, thank you so much. That was really quite moving.
Yeah,
I'm deeply grateful. So let me, next up is Pat Berry. And I have known Pat, I think it's about 35 years. It's been a while. Pat was one of my first supervisors a long time ago. Pat Berry received her diploma in analytical psychology from the C.G. Jung Institute, Zurich in 1975. She was one of the early contributors to what came to be called by James Hellman archetypal psychology. She earned her PhD in psychology in 1984 at the University of Dallas. And Pat, I think my husband typed your dissertation back then. Many of Pat's earlier talks and papers are collected in Echo's Subtle Body, a contribution to archetypal psychology. Later papers published in various places focus on a wide range of phenomena such as multiple personality disorder, child abuse, the orphan, the marginal way, film, and aesthetics. She's been professionally active with Jungian educational institutions, serving as director of training and president of both the Interregional Society of Jungian Analysts and the C.G. Jung Institute of Boston. She is currently adjunct faculty at Pacifica. Welcome, Pat. Thank you.
Well, I'm not a nurse, but my mother was. So this is going to be a very personal little talk. In a minute, I'm going to read you a poem that I wrote to my mother about 20 years ago, and I keep revising it. I've just, about 2 minutes before we started, maybe completed my last revisioning. The problem is that as I change, my relationship to this poem and my childhood and she, my mother, all that continues to change. So that's the problem. My mother was born in 1918. So in a pandemic, just like Linda's grandmother sort of went through, my mother was being born then. A lot of people got born during that pandemic. All of my mother's friends, because they were her age, right? Then they all went through the Depression too. The mothers of my friends were all born around that same time. Now, I say this to emphasize how good things come out of pandemics. I'm kind of upbeat nowadays. How I could be is another question, but I am. There are babies being born right now, lots of them. There's a terrible time in the world, as we know, I mean, we've got all these things going on, and yet there's, I feel, a terrific excitement. Way down deep somewhere, I feel the world rumbling. So my mother grew up in Middletown, Ohio, and became a nurse, joined the Navy. Became a Navy nurse, moved to California, where she worked in a Navy hospital during the war. This is in 1941. She met my father, who was a Marine, and sort of messed up her nursing career at that time. Who reminds me of Linda's grandmother. I won't go into my mother's screw-ups, but it had to do with falling in love with this guy and wanting to go off and get married. Well, she did do that, and I was what was born of that. The problem was, though, that somehow they broke up. I don't know the story of that. I wish I had gotten it. And my mother ended up a single mother. We moved to Long Beach. She worked at the hospital there, Seaside Hospital in Long Beach. And once I was 2 years old, I was able to go to a little nursery school that were run for kids as part of the war effort to take care of the kids that were, had parents doing all sorts of other things. So I was 2 years old then, and I actually walked. We lived right across from the hospital. So I walked so I must have been 2, 3, my God, walking down the blocks, 2 blocks to this nursery school. When I didn't go there, I went to the hospital, and my mother sort of got people to carry me around in, the laundry carts, which was also a wonderful way to be a kid and to be in that environment. When I was in nursery school, my mother would come to get me, and I'll never forget, she came in this nurse's cape, which is great, big, dark cape, and for me, it was like a mother bird coming, to envelop me in her arms and take me back to our apartment. I love my mother very much. Okay, so here's my poem, which is a little bit heavy because the event was heavy. I call it The Truck. I wasn't more than 4 years old. In the black Dodge coupe my mother drove as I pressed against her, bumping along that California route. We slowed behind a truck of migrant workers, swaying, happy after harvest, drinks in hand, in gesturing hands. I didn't understand. This man who suddenly walked in air. Right off this truck, he walked like Jesus. Now I wonder, could there have been a vision out there in his mind somewhere? He gave his flesh and faith to make it happen, make it real. Right off that truck, he walked in air, then disappeared down somewhere. Mother stopped the car. She made me stay inside, but I looked out the window as she took charge and raced down that steep hill into the ditch. She crouched beside this man, touched his hand and neck and wrist, and shook her head. The man was dead. I have known that place. My mother knelt in that dark ditch. I knew it then. I know it better now that I'm older. And how that place bleeds into what runs beneath, beyond the days and nights of life, and more than that, is simply a true place, this realm that lies beneath. So you see, for me, Linda, that realm is not the realm of the Titans, it's the realm of reality underneath it all. It's a kind of Buddhist, there's a kind of Buddhist sense to it for me. Now, I read this poem from my mother before she died. Thank God I did. I wish I had done a lot more before she died. Found out things that I couldn't think to ask her back when she was alive. I told her that my strength in life had come from seeing her at that moment, in that memory. She didn't know, of course, that I would even remember that or remember every detail of it. So for those of you nurses, emergency workers, whomever is in this Zoom session, please remember the strength you show and lives through you as nurses is for your children too. It may help them as it helped me sense a courage and care and commonality and acceptance with what lies beneath. For me, personally, it is certainly related to why and how I came to be a Jungian analyst, a depth psychologist. Now, maybe this was a trauma, but see, there's trauma, like Linda, what you were talking about, and collective trauma. There's also, for me, lots of traumas. I've had lots of little traumas in life, you know? And what I've found out is that they're gold as well. I mean, they became part, those traumas, in what made me me. So part of my individuation, as Jung would call it. What you all are doing, you nurses and people out there, the gods of your individuation are at work as well, I'm sure, or you couldn't be doing it. You wouldn't have the energy, you wouldn't have the guts, you wouldn't have the courage that you have. So thank you, and thank the gods that support you.
Pat, that was really profoundly moving. Really moving. And I think it's just a beautiful example of facing into suffering, being with it, not separating from it. And I think the wonderful thing that comes with getting older is knowing and understanding from one's depths that it's possible to carry that level of trauma. No one gets away without trauma. That's just part of the deal. You know, Titans are there, you know, it's part of the deal. But the good part about getting older is, if you're lucky, you learn that you can carry it. And it's from the inner helpers that come alive from knowing other parts of your psyche, maybe in dreams, artwork, expressed in music, dance, any of those other forms. But the arts, play, offer a way for those things to come forward. And it seems to me that you and all of us here have managed somehow to figure out how to bear and carry both grief, suffering, be present to that, use it creatively, help ourselves, help other people, and carry joy and pleasure at the same time, not getting rid of one. So thanks, Pat. That's just beautiful.
They go together, joy, pleasure, suffering.
Yes, exactly. Thanks. Yep. I would like to next introduce Gina Subia Belton. Gina is an educator, an emerging Indigenous scholar, and grief specialist, practicing existential medicine at Redwood Palliative Psychology. She is also a professor of psychology at Saybrook University. She has served for 20 years as a nurse educator in clinical, community, and academic settings, and her robust clinical career and nurse culture inspires her thanatology research in existential medicines, as well as she is a published poet and an author, an innovative group community facilitator with a depth of experience. Her approach braids together the lineages of indigenous psychology, depth psychology, and humanistic existential psychology with a contemplative method and methodologies, and with an eco-psychological, these are mouthfuls, Gina, the concept eco-psychological lens as a critical indigenous decolonial praxis. From her research, the concept cultivating an ethic of radical hospitality, it's beautiful, is discussed in her forthcoming book. Let's welcome Gina. Thank you.
It is a mouthful. We went through a few iterations. Thank you for your grace and persistence, Linda.
Sorry.
No worries. Before I get to my notes, I just have to share with you all my deep appreciation in this moment of our Jungian lineage together, because all we've had is a conversation, and already the circumambulation that's unfolding and unrolling in this beautiful synchronicity. I could feel the ties of my talk already emerging in the seeds of what you presented, Linda, and then opening further into the suffering of oppression and systems that my precious colleague Elizabeth spoke to, and then the deeper suffering of turning toward death, as Pat talks about. So beautiful, that poem, Pat. I couldn't wait to hear it. So thank you for that share. I'm going to start with something that if we were all together on the grounds of Pacifica, and let's just believe that we are in this moment, I would be giving a land acknowledgement to the generosity, wisdom, and gifts of the Chumash people. And since we're sitting in our own homes, or some place that we feel safe and protected, I will offer you this deep awareness that we're all resting on the generosity, wisdom, and gifts of all Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island and beyond. So what's a land acknowledgement and its purpose? It is a formal statement that recognizes and respects Indigenous peoples as traditionally responsible to relationship of this land. Relationship and relationality is at the core of our existence and psyche. So I was delighted to hear this emerge already in the thread. And this enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. And so why do we even bother to recognize the land? It is practiced as an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory you reside on and might be visiting. I've been a humble guest here in the territory of the Wiyot, the Yurok, Karuk, and Chalwat people and the Hupa, about 35, 36 years now. And it's a way of honoring the Indigenous people who've been living and working the land from time memorial. It's important to understand, particularly in these moments of our coming apart, our dismemberment, that to understand the long-standing history that has brought you to reside on the land and to seek to understand your place within that history. These acknowledgements do not exist in a past tense or a historical context. Settler colonialism is a current ongoing process, and it is imperative that we build our mindfulness of our present participation in that. And we've heard seeds of that participation already in these first unfolding stories. In Indigenous protocol in this moment, I want to give acknowledgements to all of our Indigenous and Aboriginal peoples of not just Turtle Island, but beyond and around the world. And so with that, I'd like to offer you this poetic invitation to turning toward the suffering of our times. Oh, thank you, Pat, for your opening us to that. And this is a poem by Alan Bass titled, If You Knew. What if you knew you'd be the last to touch someone? If you were taking tickets, for example, at the theater, tearing them, giving back the ragged stubs, you might take care to touch that palm, brush your fingertips along the lifeline's crease. When a man pulls his wheeled suitcase too slowly through the airport, when the car in front of me doesn't signal, when the clerk at the pharmacy won't say thank you, I don't remember they're going to die. A friend told me she'd been with her aunt. They just had lunch, and the waiter, a young gay man with plum black eyes, joked as he served the coffee, kissed her aunt's powdered cheek when they left. Then they walked half a block, and her aunt dropped dead on the sidewalk. How close does the dragon's spume have to come? How wide does the crack in heaven have to split? What would people look like if we could see them as they are, soaked in honey, stung and swollen, reckless, pinned against time? What if we would look at people what they look like, if we could see them as they are, soaked in honey, stung and swollen, reckless, pinned against time? I couldn't agree with you more heartily that the arts is a saving grace for me right now. Were it not for poetry, I don't know how I might get through a day. And meditating on this poem and the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and every other Black brother and sister killed at the hands of oppression, I'm reminded of the Mexican proverb that says, they tried to bury us. They didn't know they only planted seeds. And that speaks to my public health nursing heart. And from an Indigenous perspective, storytelling, I want to share with you, is not only a practice that is sacred, it's a pedagogy in how we translate knowledge amongst each other, right? And I love that one of my close mentors, Dr. Charles Garfield, who's, Elizabeth, you might appreciate this, he was the founder of Shanti, was the ground zero of the AIDS pandemic in San Francisco in the 80s. He's fond of saying, though, that we must have got it wrong when we named the humans Homo sapiens. We should have called ourselves Homo narrans, the ones who tell the story. Mm-hmm. And ever since humans could gather around a fire, we shared stories together. And as I said, in the Indigenous knowledge system, this is a particularly significant way of being in community, growing together and flourishing and thriving. My story of nursing has been guided by, I feel like, or reclaimed by a quote from Marion Woodman, where she says, when I say the feminine, I don't mean gender. I mean the feminine principle that is living or suppressed in both men and women. The feminine principle attempts to relate. Instead of breaking things off into parts, it says, where are we alike? How can we connect? Where is the love? Can you listen to me? Can you really hear what I am saying? Can you see me? Do you care whether you see me or not? Now, these are serious questions. And the feminine is difficult to talk about because so few people have experienced it. The feminine is presence and relatedness and a heart that can open so that when you meet another person, you actually are seeing that person's authentic self. What meaning does human life have if nobody has ever seen you? So when I think of my nurse story and the teaching story of my nursing experience, I know every nurse on this panel has been the eyes of seeing the authentic self in that last breath. Who would have guessed, would George Floyd have guessed that his last breath would have been underneath that knee on that day? So I have to share about my, that I was born to be a midwife. And though I came to realize that my midwifery was meant to be practiced at the end of life and not the beginning. And while I was struggling and studying and arguing, in these soulful dialectics at Pacifica Graduate Institute, the midwife made herself known to me in the alchemical work of Sora Mystica, tending to the soul in the end-of-life relationship after a 25-year initiation in nurse culture. So that has a lot to do with that mouthful you had at the beginning there. As a labor and delivery nurse, I have held in my lap mothers while holding their dead or dying infants. As an emergency room nurse, I embrace the sons and grandsons behind emergency room curtains while they're matriarchally dying from a dissecting aortic aneurysm, and wives as they caress the distorted remains of their husbands for the last time. In the recovery room, I have enfolded entire families in my lap as the surgeon reports that we did all that we could for your brother, your sister, your aunt, your father, your lover. I'm sorry, they did not survive the procedure. In my practice as a forensic nurse, I've lived out what I believe to be one of the most sacred aspects of my nurse training by cultivating the sacred space necessary for holding the shattered soul of subtle body as she struggled for life on the examination table. I think of you, Pat, when I wrote those words down, subtle body. This occurred while I performed the ritual of collecting DNA evidence for criminal cases from the corporeal body of survivors of sexual assault. It is an excruciatingly intimate rite, and it called for me a tenderness that I couldn't have even imagined until that moment. It was summoned for me as I bore witness to a life that will never again live as it had before the brutal moment of the trauma that is rape. Yep. How is it that I hold a capacity for being so close to such deep suffering? This was an actual question that was posed to me by Dr. Maurice Stevens when we were walking back from the campus dining hall at Pacifica, and without hesitation, I answered, my grandfather. Warriors are initiated through story, and my grandfather was a World War II vet. And as a child, I was initiated into the mystery, awe, and suffering of the dying time by my grandfather when he would come apart. And this dismemberment that occurred was held through our indigenous culture of recognizing it's okay to come apart in deep suffering. And some of us were better at holding that and participating in that initiation. And I want to share a little bit more about that and how that showed up in my nurse experience with this poem. Again, speaking about Charles Garfield, he's fond of saying that Freud had mentioned every time he thought he discovered something, he found a poet had already been there before him. And I recall that sweet little comment every time I think of the wisdom in this poem, written from the heart of an indigenous woman, Shauna Oteke McCovey of the Yurok Nations here in Humboldt County. It's called Deeper Medicine. I remember it's called Higher Medicine, excuse me, and we'll get to the deeper part in a moment. I remember that not only my call to midwifery when I read this poem, but also a beckoning to deeper medicine. And so as the mythologist Joseph Campbell advised, I began to let go of the life I was living in order to live this life that was waiting for me. I had no idea, though, that in order to answer this call, I would begin to walk a path of reconciliation and reclamation. This is the initiation of trauma that you speak to, Pat, and I agree with you. How grief and the thrownness of certain existential experiences can move us into critical initiations. And so the reconciliation of these two world views, of a Western biomedical model and indigenous ways of knowing, healing, and understanding psyche was the path, the via longa as you said, Linda, to reclamation of my decolonized indigenous mind. I would have to remember. And so again, bringing up Jung's reclamation of this process as a circular walk, I just started one step at a time. So the symbolism of the circle in the indigenous worldview demonstrates this interrelatedness of the circumambulation, that as one begins to walk, one begins to change, shift, and grow. The Cree scholar Wilson wrote, a change in one affects the other, which in turn affects new change in the original. And McCovey states this so elegantly in her poem. She says, I'm drawn to higher medicine. The way moving water is forever drawn to its ending. I chase coyotes because I have nothing to hide, because everything has a new shape and shadow in the moon's silky light. I am moved by higher medicine. The way my words move in circle and make their eventual way back to me. I chase coyotes because they hold the mystery, because every glance is an invitation to see more than I did before. I need higher medicine, the way sacred rocks need to tell their stories that begin and end and begin again. I chase coyotes because they cry old tears, because I love the smell of warm rain almost as much as they do. I chase coyotes because I'm drawn to higher medicine and songs sung in dreams. So I have chased coyotes in nurse culture all of those years because I was longing for deeper medicine. And so what did this mean? And I can only answer for myself that it was a belief of a deeper medicine emerging as an awareness of longing for liberation. But liberation from what, I had to ask myself. I was proficient in my work and caring and empathic with the patients I cared for, their families, and the colleagues I worked with. Yet every day began to feel more and more oppressive, and I could no longer turn away. I remember leaning up against the wall in the acute care unit I was working, and I said, how the hell did I get here? And I felt myself withering in this mechanistic and soul-eroding culture of the Western biomedical model. And I looked down and realized this little white dress and the little white stockings and the little white shoes of the nurse archetype they were always a little too tight and confining for me and never quite fitting. Though she was so important to my initiation, I'm reminded of Jeanette Paris' question to us, asking, not only is our archetype alive in you, important to understand, but is it the right archetype at the right time? And all those years of my initiation, you bet that was the right archetype in the right time. But then in what felt like a matter of life and death, I began to long for this deeper medicine, and I had to look deeper. And I can thank the work of Robert Romanishin when I think about his writings on remembering. And so I moved into the threshold of my nurse initiation by moving into the mysteries of the midwife in the dying time. And I opened up to an exploration of my own existential curiosity to fully embrace this longing for encountering soul as we breathe our last breath. So I recognized, what is this to remember? How do I reclaim what it is to dwell in relationality? And this recognition came only after realizing how estranged I've been from that awareness. Romanishin described remembering as an embodied engagement, a return from exile by means of the imaginal and the metaphorical movement of unforgetting. As a contemplative and conscious effort, Romanishin described that with unforgetting, we must first reflect, asking not what is to be done, but who are we? And in taking up this metaphorical movement of unforgetting and choosing to consciously dwell in the imaginal, Romanishin further describes how this could be possible. We might catch a glimpse of our own faces, and in not denying the face that is displayed there, we might explore the conditions that have made events possible. We might face the sorrow over what we have done and continue to do, might endure the grief of who we have become, and out of that grief might recover what we have lost and left behind of ourselves. I think this is right where we are. We are in this existential moment of dismemberment and really longing for remembering what we have lost, what we've left behind, and who we are. And with that, I'd like to remember our ancestors in this moment. And I'm going to ask you, if you're willing, to gently place your hand on your heart. And let us breathe deeply together in community. Because even in Zoom, across this web, we are in community. Deep breath. And the Indigenous knowledge system reminds us that we are always relationship. We're not in relationship, we're not with relationship. We are always relationship. Breathing deeply. My ancestors above me, the wise one at my back, the cherished one at my left, my unanswered self at my right. breathing deeply, I bring my awareness to one good thing in this moment. May this carry you forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Gina. I think what we're seeing here is, it feels like a very feminine experience of interconnectedness. And what comes to my mind is images of weaving. That we're weaving threads together in a very sort of feminine, circular process. So thank you. Thank you. Okay, next is Susan Ezra. Susan Ezra, her passion has always been to ignite the healing potential within an individual through the body-mind. While on staff at Hospice of Marin for 20 years, Susan pioneered bringing imagery to the bedside of hospice patients to manage pain symptoms and to enhance peace well-being. And over the past 30 years, she's been teaching individual clients and healthcare professionals to use the power of imagery for health and healing. Since co-founding and directing the certificate program in integrative imagery in 1996 with Terry Reed, Beyond Ordinary Nursing has certified nurses, social workers, and therapists nationwide. Terry and Susan were then successful in incorporating imagery services in a hospital-wide program, bringing stress management, surgery preparation, and guided imagery to staff, patients, and the community at a San Francisco Bay Area hospital. In 2008, they co-authored Guided Imagery and Beyond, Stories of Healing and Transformation, an anthology of stories from clients and students. Thanks, Susan.
Thank you, Linda. And I first must say that I am honored to be asked to speak on this panel and to be part of this group of you amazing and accomplished women who I'm just meeting. I know Juliet, but everybody else is new to me. And one of my nurse colleagues thought I would be a good person to represent her and others in my community. And that's really what I truly want to do here today, is to be a representative for all of the holistic nurses, for nurse coaches, for nurses who have brought integrative imagery and guided imagery and Reiki and healing touch and dozens of other modalities to nursing, to the bedside, to all of the people who we've touched. And as already has been mentioned, you know, nurses have always been at that threshold of life, of birth, of death, of suffering, of joy, of being able to be present in presence of pain. We've instinctively known how to show up and how to minister to those who are in need. We, though, have now created a new archetype of what it is to be a nurse as the holder of sacred space and the one that can facilitate the empowerment of another to access their own innate healing abilities within their body, mind, heart, and spirit. And through this partnership and the mutuality that happens, we're aiding others in healing, as well as for nurses, we're learning to heal ourselves. You know, and that's a long cry from the old paradigm of what it is to be a fixer and a problem solver and somebody who is overly responsible and often sacrifices self for being in the service or the caregiving of others. So we're changing. And I believe that the best way I can illustrate this
story that I'm going to tell is to come from my almost 30 years of experience as being an integrative imagery teacher and practitioner. And let me define what integrative imagery is. Some people still don't know what guided imagery is, but integrative imagery is a specialty. It's a modality. And it's even more personal and powerful than guided imagery because it helps a person access and interact with their own images directly in the imaginal realm. And so that's my love and passion. So my story is going to be a client's healing journey, and it's only going to be a snapshot of it because there's so much more to tell. And it was really a challenge to decide which story to pick out of so many people that I've been privileged to work with. But when I meditated, this one came forth. And I just got to talk to this person yesterday and got her blessings to share her story. So JW is the initials I gave her, is a woman with stage 4 ovarian cancer with pretty extensive metastases that was just diagnosed last fall. And she's had the full gamut of treatment. She's had even more some than that. Heavy dose chemo, radical surgery, and then complications from that surgery, and then ended up with another surgery. So she was critically ill for several months. And through all of this, she's used integrative imagery and other healing modalities as well. So here's what she's discovered. She began her journey by calling upon her real-life Irish ancestor, great Aunt Betty. I love how we're calling in the ancestors. And Aunt Betty was a brave and strong army nurse in World War I. And the client brings in a photo of Aunt Betty with other nurses, all riding on a camel, their own camel, in Egypt with the pyramids in the background. So that was how we started. Mm-hmm. Next, she connects with a powerful sword from her Aikido practice. It's a type of sword used by the samurai. It's made of tempered steel, and it's called a katana. So in her imagery ongoing, all of her immune system cells carry their own katanas to cut out the cancer cells, to cut out fear, and then to cut in courage and love. Next in her imagery, she confronts the naysayer, the doomsday part of herself. That's in the form of a dark, cackling Halloween witch. And that witch first seems very overshadowing, but then admits to being very afraid and being a victim. In her imagery healing place, which she's had several, she first meets her first inner healer, an African-American woman named Celeste, with amazing strength and dignity and ability to weather adversity. And Celeste provides love, healing energy, and deep nurturance. And on the day of her actual surgery, the person who transported her to the operating room looks surprisingly like Celeste. Now she continues to recover. She has a new inner healing place. It's in the mountains. It's overlooking a vista. And there she meets a new inner healer, a female wolf named Grace, who offers reassurance and safety and strength and nourishment. And Grace sits on her right side where she can pet her fur and feel her protection. And on her left side sits her lab, Andy, who's deceased, and he can be a companion And then above, there can be seen a glorious owl, a new addition, a glorious owl flying around, surveying the landscape and watching. And JW feels security with him doing that. So her journey continues and our journey continues. And I really do, in my heart of hearts, believe that the imagination and the imaginal realm is where we all have to go and come from for healing for ourselves and really for the planet and all of us on it.
Lovely.
So thank you.
Thank you, Susan. That's just beautiful. You're getting ready for this. I've been doing a lot of reading about Florence Nightingale, and she visited the Parthenon before she went to nursing school in Germany. She came from an upper class family. They didn't want her to go to nursing school. It was seen as a lower class. She was an assistant. So she was in the Parthenon, and she found a baby owlet, a baby owl like this big, and she carried that owl, that pet owl, in her pocket. So I was thinking as you were giving the story about Athena, the presence of Athena, kind of Pallas Athena, clear-eyed Athena, who can see through into the dark places and be present and as a guide.
Yeah, her owl was her totem. Totem animal. Yeah.
Next, I'm very happy to introduce Bonita. And I had the great pleasure of being in a consultation group that I led at Pacifica. Bonita was part of that, and it was always a great pleasure to have you in class, Bonita. You had so much to offer and had a sort of presence and a solidity and a stability. And my mother, we lived in a place where people didn't move from where they lived, where they grew up, where their relatives had come from and so forth. And so the greatest compliment my mother could give when she'd be talking about someone, a name would come up, she would say, "Oh, she's an old nurse," meaning not she's an old nurse, but she's a nurse. She's like us. She's one of us. And so I always have felt like that, Bonita, with you. And I'm very pleased that you're part of this group.
Thank you.
So yes, Bonita is a board-certified psychiatric nurse practitioner licensed to prescribe medications. She describes her life and career nursing as a series of wonderful accidental happenings. I've heard some of those. They're quite something. Beginning as a volunteer in a hospital at age 16, me too, nursing has taken her all over the world and opened vistas she never dreamed existed as a kid in Mobile, Alabama, during an era when girls were not supposed to get an education or go far from home. She has enjoyed working in home health care, nursing homes, community mental health centers, operating room, and trauma centers. Is that all? She has been on faculty and lectured at universities, led seminars, workshops, and retreats, and worked as a research pharmacotherapist, organizational business consultant, and motivational speaker. Bonita earned a certification as a marriage and family therapist, hypnotherapist, and executive coach. She retired from the U.S. Army after serving in 2 wars, Vietnam and the Gulf War. She has served on professional and civic boards and co-founded a nonprofit foundation for promoting advanced practice psychiatric nursing. She brings her love of learning to her therapy practice in Seattle, Washington, and to Pacifica Graduate Institute, where she is currently enrolled in the PhD, Depth Psychology, and Integrative Therapy Healing Practices program. That's our sponsors today. At age 76, wow, I didn't know your age. Bonita states that she is grateful that nursing found her. It has been the perfect path for someone who prizes adventure, craves creative, intimate connections, and delights in synchronicities. It sounds like we should send you out to recruit for nursing programs.
Yeah, right.
Please welcome Bonita.
Thank you, Linda. So since that's my life history, I will go directly into a story about what I experienced as a nurse, which really encapsulates one of the things that keeps me going and has kept me going all these years. When I see what the nurses have done during the COVID-19 pandemic, many of them leaving their homes and families and their jobs and going to New York and other places to help out and putting themselves in harm's way, you stop and you say, why would they do a thing like that? There's so much that we get as nurses back from being involved with people and in being in those kinds of situations that keeps our blood going. So it just, I feel like it's all coming full circle for me, coming back to a time when one of my first experiences in nursing that was very impactful for me was during the Vietnam War, and I was in Japan during the Tet invasion, when suddenly we were inundated with thousands and thousands of young men who were seriously wounded, and when they couldn't fly them back to the States, they would fly them to Japan in helicopters where we were located, and then we would patch them up and send them on to other places in the United States. And there was a particular young man that I recall one day who was so severely injured. He was quadriplegic. He couldn't talk because he had tracheostomy, and he had IVs and tubes going through every single part of his body. And since he couldn't talk, when I would go over to his he was on a particular kind of mattress or frame that kept him not in a regular bed. So he couldn't stay in a regular bed. So I would walk over to him to check his IVs or to give him some medication. And he would look at me and then look at his bedside stand. And each time he did that, I would go and open up the little stand and get his wallet out so that he could see the picture of the girl that he married just before he went to Vietnam. And she was young. They were both 19, and I would hold the picture up to him so he could see her face, and his eyes would fill with tears. And so I knew he was deeply in love with her, and he would thank me with his eyes, and I would put the picture back in the wallet and put it back in his nightstand. I had a habit at that time of when I would see somebody I didn't think was going to live, I'd call a friend of mine, and she would come from Tokyo to where I was in Yokohama, and she had a knack for grabbing a quick portrait with a pencil and paper. And so she would draw pictures of these different young men and draw their pictures with their faces, and then I would let them dictate a letter home to their wife or their sweetheart or something, and then I would put it in an envelope with that picture and mail it to the wife or family, whoever it was. So I had called her that night, and she came over, and I pointed to this young man, and I said, I don't think he's going to make it. So she went over and sat next to him and captured a beautiful picture of his, a little line drawing of his face. And then I wrote the letter, and he would nod that, blink his eyes, that's a good line. He liked that one. So I would write this love letter to his wife and then put it in the envelope and send it back home. Well, he was transferred to Walter Reed, and then I didn't know what happened to him after that. And about 3 years later, I was driving across country in the United States, and I happened to find myself in Ohio. And I don't know anything about Ohio, and I was just driving through, and suddenly I saw a road sign that looked familiar, and the name of the little town where I had mailed that letter to came up. I thought, well, that's interesting. I remembered that town, and I remembered that young man very, very well. And I thought, wonder if if his family's there, or maybe his wife. I didn't think that he had lived. So I stopped and I looked in the phone booth, which we had phone, you remember we used to have phone books. I looked in the phone book and I saw his name in the phone book. And I thought, oh my goodness, it couldn't be him. Maybe it is, maybe not. So I put the dime in the phone, and then I called that number. And a man answered the phone, and I asked him, I said, I'm trying to find this person who was a soldier during Vietnam, and I told him my name, and he immediately recognized my name. And I thought, I can't believe it could be this guy. So it turned out it was his father. It wasn't him. But he said, he's still alive, and I'll give you his address and phone number if you want to call him. So I said, of course. So I had another dime, so I called the number that he gave me, and his wife answered the phone. And so when I told her who I was, she immediately said, oh, I know who you are. And I said, really? So she said, yes, would you like to come over? And I said, of course. She said, well, can you come tomorrow for dinner? Well, I hadn't planned on stopping for the night, but I said, well, sure, what am I going to? So I stopped and I stayed in a little motel. And the next night I called before I was to come over, and she said, now be sure you stand at the front door and wait. Don't just, wait for a minute. I said, okay. So when I got there, she answered the door and then opened it up, and he was standing there. I was completely amazed. And he said, I told you I would walk again. And they had the braces on his legs that went up to his waist with them all strapped in so he could stand up straight and walk. I couldn't believe it, that he had lived, that he could walk. And not only that, he had gone back home. They had adopted a beautiful little girl. He had put together, his hobby was rebuilding old cars. He built a Model A Ford. He had finished school. I was stunned. So whenever I have hard times, I think about that young man, and I think about how much he loved his wife. And I know that love that he had for her is what caused him to have the courage and strength to live. So I know that love is what keeps us going. Love is what makes us alive. And that the courage to see what other people can get through and what they live in what they endure is what gives me courage too when I have hard times. So nursing is a career and a lifestyle. It's a life for me. It's not just a career. But the life is one of not just giving, but also receiving the wonderful, wonderful gifts that people have. I really appreciate that nursing found me. Thank you.
It's a beautiful story, Benita.
Thank you.
Beautiful, thank you. It seems to me that nurses have always performed such an important role in making connections. And how I understood nursing theory at the outset, Dorothy Orum's self-care theory, self-agency, I'd never heard that before. It's the power to act on one's own behalf. And I think that's where there's a call for nursing. When someone can't do that for themselves, nurses bridge the gaps. They are the connectors. Hermes, Hecate, they make the connections. They hold the paradoxes. They fill in the gap. They make the connections. And I think, Bunny, that's an absolutely beautiful story. This is beautiful. Thank you. Juliet, I'm going to hand it back to you. I think at this point, this has been a wonderful morning. I'm grateful to this whole group, and I feel that this is an incredible example of an emergent system of co-creative, co-collaborative, co-constructing connectedness. I don't know what else to say. It's been very moving, and I feel deeply honored to have been a part of it. And I so appreciate, Juliet, you're coming up with this idea and engaging with me and bringing this group together. And I think your intuition was really a good one. We really didn't know one another for the most part. And I am deeply grateful to you for creating a space, a sacred space, a liminal space in between worlds through all this technology for all of us to be together. I'm just sorry that we can't see or be directly with the audience. On the other hand, we're doing the best we can with what we got, and I think that's a lot of what nursing is about. So many thanks, Juliet. Thanks to all of you for spending time and weaving together this beautiful tapestry. So Juliet, I'll hand it to you. Thank you. Thanks all.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you for all of you. I've been so moved as I sit here and listen to each of you uniquely coming from the heart, and these stories are so varied and different, but each of them show that nursing can be experienced in so many different ways, and I hope that we can continue this conversation. It's very, very moving. All right, so and I also appreciated taking the moment to rest into our heart. Gina, so thank you for that as well. Well, we've reserved time here for some questions and answers, comments, and Gavin and I will be monitoring that process. So for those of you on the call, please go ahead and use the chat area on the right-hand side of your screen for any kinds of questions or comments. And Gavin and I will be monitoring this. And for anyone who's come on late and wonders who I am and why, I probably should have put my video out, I realize. But I'm the chair of the Depth Psychology Integrative Therapy and Healing Practices Program at Pacifica. And I noticed Rika Toribio came on board, and she's the director of admissions. So anyone who wants to stay after this call, she and I are willing to stay for 5-10 minutes, if you'd like. Let's move into some questions and answers here, and comments, and any other pieces that each of you speakers would want to share as well. So Gavin, how are we doing here? What have we opened to?
All right, the chat is now open to attendees, and we've also got our Q&As. So whichever format you prefer, go ahead and let us know what your thoughts are.
I might mention we did receive a couple of questions ahead of time, and I won't say names because we're recording this, and I don't know who is, giving their consent to have their names and all of that shared. But what I will share the questions, just so we have them. Okay, I put them on a different sheet. That's interesting. Here we go. Yeah, and one of them, I think that some of you are going to be meeting up afterwards with her. She's doing her dissertation, and asked some rather fascinating and deep questions. I think I will go ahead and read them, but we're going to come back to that later for you. She asks, how did nurses historically factor into the genesis of Jung's psychology in his time at the Bergholtzy? And she read that there were 6 physicians on staff there, along with almost 200 nurses, attending to around 300, 400 patients. And she's not heard any accounts of nurses' engagement with those patients, even though they'd like to have had more contact with patients than the physicians, more heavily influenced patient outcomes. So she's curious about the existence of written or oral histories of nurses on staff alongside Jung, and that of their descendants, if anyone knows. So she's thinking that these accounts don't exist in any public way, nor are they shareable in any way as part of Jung's psychology and his extensive historical shadow even. And she has a strong intention and interest in conducting research around these areas and would love to interview people too. So this is in conjunction with her dissertation. And she may also develop a documentary project around this. She's also interested in the panelists' thoughts on the relational patterns of the nurse, especially patterns in the nurse as mother, and maybe the shadow and the light side of that. That's one that I think perhaps you could comment on. So maybe we'll start with looking at that. Anyone have any responses to that last one? The relational.
I wrote, the relation. I was going to respond to the historical. I'd be happy to talk to Amanda about that later. I have a lot of ideas about that. The medical records of Sabina Spielrein, for example, were published in the Journal of Analytical Psychology a while back. So I think the hospital records might be available. And the Bergholtzy was the most famous hospital of its day, as everyone probably knows. But it was a therapeutic community. And when you signed on there, when August Farrell was in charge, he was a teetotaler, so he couldn't drink. So doctors, nurses, families, everybody lived there. And that's been true of straight mental hospitals forever. But my grandmother, my mother, my sister-in-law, even through the 70s, they lived on the campus. And there was the value of a therapeutic community is very well known. And as a child therapist, I was involved in a lot of that kind of stuff in the 70s and 80s. But nobody will pay for that anymore, even though it works. And it included things like art therapy, nature, food, careful diet, and so forth and so on. Anyway, if Amanda contacts me, I'm happy to help her. Ernst Faltz, I know a number of historians whom she might get in touch with, so I'm happy to help her with that part.
And I'll just comment briefly on the mother versus nurse archetype. The Roman charity is a great symbol of that goes back to, thousands of years. And it really depicts the nurse taking care of the elder, the dying, the old, whereas the mother takes care of the baby, the infant. So I see the mother and the nurse quite differently, actually. So maybe other people have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I remember early on in my research too, and I think you and I had some conversations around it, Elizabeth, when Elizabeth was the year ahead of me in school. So we would meet in the library or that conference room and just dig in. I, like you, came to the same conclusion that while nurse and nursing has the maternal quality to it, it is a completely different archetype, which of course is what led me down the path of individuating into, the midwife and recognizing that aliveness. And like Linda, my practice as an educator and tender to the soul of dying is as a midwife. And I remember thinking or writing some paper around signifiers. I love when I start to get lost in the weeds of my research, I go right to etymology, and I love that with words. And I thought about nursing, and so what does that mean to nourish? And then of course, if you're going to really amplify that, what does that look like according from a depth psychological lens? The good mother and the bad mother, and we're going to start to go into all kinds of amazing circumambulations, but I think even just that little piece of the question is such an extraordinary curiosity to follow.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Gina. Shall we move to the next question that was presented? Or Pat, you've got something? I see other questions coming in too. Thank you.
Pat, you're muted.
Yeah, I know. It just takes a while to find all the right.
I know, I'm with you.
About hospitals in Zurich, in addition to Berkolzli and others, actually, there was the clinic am Zurichberg.
Yeah.
When I was there, and I think that was probably began in the 1950s or so. And I also volunteered there, worked there, did clinical, was part of clinical groups taught by Tony Fry. Felix was there, Meyer was there, and there was a lot. Joan Bourresh was head of the atelier. The atelier, was the art thing, and that was really the center of the place. And all the tables and what all the patients were doing. Anybody in the community almost could volunteer, within the union, could volunteer and go in and help and take people on walks and do all that kind of stuff. It was really pretty good.
Alive.
Yeah. Okay, that's all.
That's great. Thank you. Someone else mailed in a question or emailed in a question, and then I'll go to there two on the screen. I see two. And this one says, since about 300 BC, the world has been ruled by violence, war, and/or domination. We are told the antidote is nonviolence. Gandhi and Mandela are the examples. But what is obvious is their effect was short-lived. Do you see any hope of a changed society, and how could this happen? It's kind of a big question.
Huge. I think there'd be a lot of different points of view on that one. That's a complicated.
This writer added after the quoted question that he thinks that it may be the rise of the feminine. What does the panel think about that? Be curious to see if that shows up.
Well, that resonates with me, Julia, because, and see what Pat and Linda think about this, because it takes me right to Marion Woodman's quote about the feminine and interrelatedness and relationality for the indigenous knowledge system. When we had our first call, I remember sharing that, and I said it during my piece, that we're not in relationship, we're always We're always relationship. And so the question to ask ourselves is, what's the nature of our relationship in the moment? And as we can see right now, the nature of our relationship is, as Linda pointed out, fractured and a little threadbare in certain places, and wanting and longing in others. So I think this radical uncertainty is calling for some radical creativity. And that's where we get to radical hospitality, Linda. How much of this paradox can I hold? And I think that's what the nurse archetype in us can call forward. And the midwife will support the birth of that. But she also, the midwife, especially how I embody her, will hold in the dying of that doesn't need to be, doesn't serve us anymore.
I think we could spend a whole day on that alone. I mean, see, I'm not so big on anima, animus, the feminine. It feels reductive to me. And I've gotten interested in working on the meaning of paradox. If you don't have paradox, you don't have play, you don't have creativity. You need challenge, you need clash, you need disruption for things to change. The Renaissance came out after the plague. I mean, you need, these things are horrible and it's awful. But I don't know how else change can happen sometimes unless there's a breaking through, or unless you're pulled down to the underworld like Persephone, or those kinds of things. So I was teaching a paradox in play and a transpersonal class. But when you talk about paradox like that and polarities, you're talking in binaries. So I feel that the whole trans thing, it's a collective cultural thing that can help us all at every level, that we don't just get locked in either or, that we can, there's a fluidity with Hermes that moves, that crosses boundaries, it's back and forth, not one or the other. I think if we get locked in that, it feels to me like old language. It doesn't really do it for me. But I think this could be a hot topic and debatable. That's just my point of view about it.
Which speaks exactly to what you're talking about, right? Isn't that great? The fact that it has that kind of catalytic fire to it can... Yeah, open things right up.
But I wouldn't necessarily just call that the feminine either, I don't
know. Kali's pretty destructive, sister.
And Kali's here for sure. Yep. She is in force. Yeah. I have to also share the wonderful quote from Arundhati Roy, the author. Another world is not only possible, she's on her way. And on a quiet day, I can hear her breathing.
That's beautiful. Thank you. While we're on the feminine, or talking about this a little bit, there's someone else who has a question that refers to this. I'm curious about the roles of doctor versus nurse as energies of masculine versus feminine. Should we keep these roles separate? In the medical landscape, can we bring them together in the divine marriage as union of opposites? Is there utility in keeping these roles separate? What will caregiving look like in the future if we can have both roles respecting both sides? Okay.
Yeah, Elizabeth, yeah, go for it.
I looked at Elizabeth too.
So very different people are drawn to medicine than nursing. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And really important distinction, I think. And when nurses and physicians work well together, it is the most amazing, beautiful thing. And I've had many experiences like that. And it's also, there's often a lot of conflict. Mm-hmm. I think of physicians more as Apollonic, more clear from a distance, and nursing more Dionysian, more merged with the patient, much more susceptible to the give and take. And I sort of see the nurse and patient as like one archetype together. So that's just a little bit on the difference. But yeah, I think there's importance in separation. Actually, Florence Nightingale saw that as well and developed the profession separately to make sure nurses did not report to physicians, and they still don't. We still don't report to physicians. We have our own profession, our own practice. But when we work together, boy, it's powerful. And I really wish nurses and physicians would take back the reins of running healthcare and hospitals.
I agree. You're here.
Mm.
So I like to think about the difference being between caring and curing. So for me, nurses care about the entire life of a person, everything that they do all day long. When I'm sitting and listening to someone talk, I'm imagining what they have for breakfast, what they, how, you know, their bathroom habits. I think about every aspect of their daily lives in their detail. In a detailed kind of way, and how they function with their friends and neighbors and family and schools. So I think about the integrated parts of the entire person and care about every single aspect of that. It's about seeing myself as an instrument of healing and in a caring relationship with someone. And I'm not interested necessarily in curing or finishing something up, if that makes sense. Of course, I want people to be cured of whatever ailment they might have, but that's not my goal. My goal is to help that person care enough for themselves to achieve the kind of healing state that they want and what they decide, not what I decide. So to me, there's a different relationship that develops when I'm in a position of helping that individual achieve what they want for their lives, not what I want.
Thank you. I think we have time for maybe one more question. We're running, yeah, just for a brief answer. There are more questions coming in. I apologize, listeners. We will not have a chance to get to all of your questions, so I'm kind of going with how they're coming in first.
So Juliet, we have someone on camera that's muted. Is it possible to hear from her?
Rika Toribio, and she will be, Rika, can you say a brief hello?
Of course. Well, good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone and all our participants. Again, my name is Rika Toribio. I'm the Senior Director of Enrollment Management for Pacifica Graduate Institute, and I am here to assist with questions about the admissions process, particularly for our PhD in depth psychology with specialization in integrative therapy and healing practices. So should you have questions about these, please feel free to bring those to the chat. I look forward to hearing from you all.
Thank you, Rika. So Rika and I have agreed that anyone who wants to stay over when we end at 1:15, we will stay on the line and answer any questions about the program. Any of you speakers are welcome to stay for that too. In fact, one of the questions is asking about that. I wonder if that question can wait until after, if that's okay. And I think finally we'll jump to this one that came up. Now it's starting to scroll down because we're getting more. I'll come back to this. Can you address need for containment safety in a profession where people seem adverse to vulnerability?
Yeah. In China, it's very dangerous to come forward with your vulnerability because you can't succeed in that system. It's very left brain. If you're a girl child, a supervisee just told me yesterday, her mother was malnourished. This is after 6 years. I knew parts of it. The mother was malnourished. My supervisee was born. A brother had died 2 years before, froze to death. This young woman was born. The auntie called her weak and ugly, and they were going to let her die. And the mother said no. And she's beautiful. She's finally come into her own. Yesterday, she told me she'd had a dream of a peacock.
Oh.
And when she started out, she was like, and now, so, it's just so painful to see these kinds of situations where people aren't recognized, not only not recognized, they're murdered because they're girls. And that's global. I mean, that's going on. And, there are all kinds of awful things. So, how do we cope with that? I think we do the best we can collectively. We do the best we can with the patient who's in front of us. We fight, we vote, we protest, we do all those kinds of things. But in order to take care of ourselves, it's very important to differentiate empathy from identification. Mm-hmm. I can be with you, I can feel it, I can be present, my heart is here. But I've learned through the years that after 40, it's really important not to think about my patients. And wait and see what bubbles up from my unconscious. And I get niggles that tell me, oh, you better, and I trust that now. It comes through. It's important to let go and know that you're not them, you're not you. And it's an honoring of a separation and differentiation. So that's a very complex question, but that's how I would respond.
Thank you. So we're at 1:16. Anyone who has further questions, if you want to email them to me, I just left my email on the chat, and I'd be happy to send them to the panelists and see if they'd like to answer them, and I could send those back. So at this point, I'd like to thank all of you who came on to be participants and listened today and engage with questions and comments. And I'd also especially like to thank Linda, our moderator and keynote speaker and planner, and Susan Ezra, who I've known through Imagery International, and Pat Berry, thank you so much, one of our faculty at Pacifica, and Elizabeth Ann Robinson for that wonderful message to nurses.
New York Times.
And for bringing us right back into our hearts in that moment of recognizing the Chumash land and all the other land that we reside on, and bringing to mind ancestors. All of you did, which is so beautiful. And Bonita, that really moving story. Thank you. So any of you who'd like to stay on, Rika Toribio and I now will stay on this call, and we will answer any questions for anyone who's jumped into the listening and would like to stay on. Just ask a few questions. For those of you who have other things to do, there are lots of protests going on today, and I'd like to rest to do what you like. Honestly, yeah. But,
really find a place to put your good body and your loud voice.
Yes. But bless you and thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Linda.
Bye.
Okay. Let's see if anybody's staying on. Is there anybody staying on? It's hard to know because we can't see you. So, Linda, you're muted.
Am I?
Hang on. There we go. I've unmuted her.
Just,
All right. Looks like we've still got about 26 attendees.
Okay.
Wow.
And Bonita, thank you for staying on too. I saw she took a little break, but she's one of our students. So I think you're in a great position maybe to answer some of these questions. And Evergreen Herricks has joined us, and she is our program administrator for the depth psychology. I'm going to say the name of it again. Depth Psychology Integrative Therapy and Healing Practices Program. It's long. Okay, so let's see what kinds of questions we might have here. Thanks for staying on, Linda, as well.
I'm happy to.
She's one of our faculty.
I've always felt that the DPT program would be perfect for nurses. We've talked about this a lot.
Me
and
too.
So I just think it would be a great fit because isn't it a requirement you have to come in with some sort of master's license?
Yes.
So licensable degree, but you can go on about it, but it just seems to me, and now, 60% of nurses surveyed recently said that they're going to leave hospital care after the pandemic. There's going to be a huge nursing shortage, but nursing's a good launch pad for all kinds of things, and maybe that's important, and we need to figure out how to bring nurses, in and all that kind of. But this would be an option, for another way of developing one's career in a depth psychological way. I think it's worth thinking about.
I think so too, and certificates. You have to kind of check it because you don't have to be a licensed clinician per se. That's where I think we can bring in so many. It's called Integrative Therapy and Healing Practices Program for a reason. Well, I'm going to go back to this question because this person's been waiting since 1 o'clock. I deeply love the thread of all your rich, deep stories of what called you to the path as a nurse and healer. I heard some of you are in the Depth Integral program currently. I'm curious how this program integrates and guides your path even further as a healer. I'm not a nurse, but on the MFT track. And before that was a dancer and artist, and found all the creative endeavors, including very healing. Does the PhD DEP program weave nurse and therapist? Well, I think, Bonita, you might be in a position to answer that one, since you are a nurse and a therapist and you're in the program.
Yeah, I'm looking for that question. I don't see it in the chat line.
It was in the Q&A. There are two different
Oh, was it? Okay.
going on, and I'm trying to...
Yeah, because I also saw one that was interesting about the difference between the diploma nurse, and that was interesting too, because I started out with a 3-year diploma in nursing. And I also, it's been 20 years ago, came back to Pacifica and did a year's work in the mythological studies program. And I really enjoyed that quite a lot. But I found that it didn't integrate for me, or I wasn't able to at that point to integrate the mythological learnings that I could see in my everyday practice, but I wasn't able to really directly integrate that learning into my practice. So one of the things that attracted me to coming back to Pacifica and participating in the DPT program, this particular course, is the fact that there was an emphasis on that we could actually, we talked about our clinical practices in the classroom, and that what we were learning, we applied to case studies, and we were encouraged to do that in our writing as well. So it was a place of pulling together myth, the Jungian thought, all the things with depth psychology together, and bringing it to my awareness. So many times I was doing these things in my practice but wasn't aware of it. So it was very helpful. So I was the only nurse in my group, but there were social workers and other professionals also. So
yeah, thank you, Bonita.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I hope that answered the question a bit. If there's more,
let's see if there are any others. You know, I think people probably still had questions around the panelists and nursing in general, but I'm looking only now specifically for our program. And if there are still 20 people who are just listening, let's see, there's a Q&A. Let's see.
There was one thing that I was curious about, the question from someone who asked about the movement from the diploma school where we were all trained. You know, we actually lived together for 3 years. We worked in the hospital. We were integral to the hospital work because we were actually part of the staff, you might say. We provided care for the patients in the hospital. So I see somewhat of a movement of that kind of, although we now today wouldn't say that we would only take women, we would only not allow you to be married or have children. We would not require you to live in the hospital and all that sort of thing. But I see a movement of being back to the place where nurses are intricately involved with how can I say, in a very practical kind of way. So for a while, it seemed as though there was a movement to academic and university training and all of that sort of thing. And there was a hue and cry that nurses weren't having enough contact with patients to feel that deep connection that we wanted and needed as nurses. So I see that there's more of that coming back around, with nurses being very connected with patients and not so separated from them. Maybe that's just because nurses always want to be intimate with people. We don't really want to be separate. So there was no way that we were going to, even when we moved from one particular kind of education to a different one, nurses were not going to ever be all in our heads or in the ivory tower. We were always going to be closely connected.
Yeah, thank you for that. Well, we promised we'd keep people just about 10 minutes, and that's where we are. I wonder, Rika, if anyone is listening and is a little bit shy about asking about admission processes, if you might just give a quick, you know, how they can contact, or, you know, you or me. I've given mine, but you can give your contact.
Absolutely. Thanks, Juliet. Yes. So what we can do is absolutely, you can reach out to us at admissions@pacifica.edu, so you can forward all your questions there. But I also want to let you all know that we are still accepting applications for this PhD in Deaf Psychology with Integrative Therapy and Healing Practices program. For the fall 2020 quarter, however, we will still remain remote through December 31st, 2020. And then, so all of our classes would be a combination of synchronous and asynchronous learning, where we have our learning management platform that you will be getting your classes in, and coupled with some Zoom meetings. And then afterwards, you will have your individual time to work on your other projects as well. And then hopefully by the winter quarter, we would all be allowed to return and have classes as normal. And yeah, also, as what was mentioned very briefly earlier, this program does require you to have a master's degree, and some of the admissions requirements would be 3 letters of recommendation, a personal statement, of course, your transcripts, among other things. But again, we could definitely walk you through the process, and we will be walking you through the admissions process once you apply. To apply, you just have to go to our website, and there is an Apply Now button there. As soon as you do that, we will have our admissions advisor. His name is Jake Sandell. He is assigned for this program, and he will be contacting you again to walk you through the process and let you know which sort of documents that you're still needing, and to let you know how far along you are through that enrollment funnel. So yes, please contact us through admissions@pacifica.edu and click on the apply button on our website. It's very easy. It takes about 2 minutes to fill out the application. It's very painless. We look forward to hearing from you all.
Thank you, Rika. There's an information day coming up as well, and that's, yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yes, that is on June 27. June 27, that's on a Saturday. We will have our virtual experience day, and that used to be our open house when our campus was open. So we would invite all students who are interested in all programs to come and see us at Pacifica. But now we have switched this to a virtual event. So that will be from 10 a.m. through 2:30. You can RSVP for that already in our website under the admissions events link. And that is your opportunity, not just for this particular program, but to also meet faculty, chair, and staff from the entire Pacifica community. So again, that will be June 27th, starting at 10 a.m.
And I'll be there for the breakout groups where it's a little more intimate, and we will be able to see each other and be a little more interactive, and I can give you more details about some of the nuances of the program. And Evergreen is here if you just want to show us your voice and a wave. This is our wonderful Evergreen who works with us in the program as our
Hey, good to see everyone. Wonderful panel. Thank you so much. And yes, we have a fantastic program, and come be in it.
Yes.
Well, and those intro days are worth going to. Aren't they kind of like little conferences? You have presenters and from the different programs. And I think they're very interesting. And it's a chance to see the other people who are applying, their interesting talks, their breakout groups. You can try out the different programs. And I think and don't they get a discount if they apply or something?
Yeah.
Yes, Linda, thanks for mentioning that. Yes, absolutely. If you show up to our intro day, our virtual experience day, we waive the $75 application fee.
Yeah.
But also we will waive the $75 application fee for those of you who have attended this event. So we will do that as well.
Oh,
that's great.
That's great. No, thank you for mentioning that. Yes, and we would love to have more nurses in this program. Absolutely. So anyway, we've taken a great deal of your time now. It's 1:30. And again, you can follow up with any questions. And we'd love to have your feedback as well. So you can just email that to me.
And nursing topics for the future. I think it would be really interesting to do a whole Florence Nightingale thing, and collective culture shifting from times of. There's a project I'm working on, art plague and the art plague and innovation following that, and how that might. So there are a number of topics we could pursue, and I'd be interested to hear what audience members might like to hear about.
Yeah, I didn't mention that Linda was possibly doing a 4-part series, and would be really interested in hearing from you about those particular topics you're interested in, anything specifically, right? And any kind of feedback from the talks today. We're getting a lot of wonderful feedback in the chat and in the Q&A, but anything else that you'd like to share, the strengths, the weaknesses, growing edges, anything you would have liked to have seen, or what you particularly liked, we're happy to receive those. So, okay, well, have a wonderful day, everyone, and whatever you're doing next, enjoy this day, or be out there protesting, whatever it is that's calling you right now. And thank you very, very much.